This is a sad story. We all seem to be at war. Many of us conscripted against an enemy we don't even know how is going to manifest. So this is Frank O'Connor's Guests of the Nation. At dusk, the big Englishman Belcher would shift his long legs out of the ashes and ask, "Well, chums, what about it?" A noble or me would say, "As you please, chum," for we had picked up some of their curious expressions. And the little Englishman, Hawkins, would light the lamp and produce the cards. Sometimes Jeremiah Donovan would come up of an evening and supervise the play and grow excited over Hawkins' cards, which he always played badly. I shouted at him as if he were one of our own. "Oh, you devil, why didn't you play the 3? But ordinarily, Jeremiah was a sober and contented poor devil, like the big Englishman Belcher, and was looked up to at all only because he was a fair-handed documents, though slow enough at these, I vow. He wore a small cloth hat and big gaiters over his long pants, and seldom did I see his hands outside the pockets of that pants. He reddened when you talked to him, tilting from toe to heel and back and looking down at his big farmer's feet. His uncommon broad accent was a great source of jest to me, I being from the town, as you may recognize. I couldn't see at the time the point of me and Noble being with Belcher and Hawkins at all, for it was and is my fixed belief you could have planted that pair in any untended spot from this to Clear Galway, and they'd have stayed put and flourished like a native weed. I'd never seen in my short experience 2 men that took to the country as they did. They were handed on to us by the 2nd Battalion to keep when the search for them became too hot. And Noble and myself, being young, took charge with a natural feeling of responsibility. But little Hawkins made us look right fools when he displayed he knew the countryside as well as we did, and sometimes more. "You're the bloke they call Bonaparte," he said to me. "Well, Bonaparte, Mary Bridget O'Connell was asking about you and said how you'd a pair of socks belonging to her young brother." For it seemed, as they explained it, that the 2nd used to have little evenings of their own, and some of the girls of the neighbourhood would turn in, and seeing they were such decent fellows, our lads couldn't well ignore the 2 Englishmen, but invited them in, and were hail fellow well met with them. Hawkins told me he learned to dance the walls of Limerick, and the siege of Venice, and the ways of Troy in a night or 2, though naturally he could not return the compliment, because our lads at that time did not dance foreign dances on principle. So whatever privileges and favours Belcher and Hawkins had with the 2nd, they duly took with us. And after the first evening, we gave up all pretence of keeping a close eye on their behaviour. Not that they could have got far, for they had a notable accent and wore khaki tunics and overcoats with civil pants and boots, but it is my belief they never had an idea of escaping, and were quite contented with their lot. Now, it was a treat to see Belcher got off with this old woman of the house we were staying in. She was a great warrant to scold, and crotchety even with us. But before ever she had a chance of giving our guests, as I may call them, a lick of her tongue, Belcher had made her his friend for life. She was breaking sticks at the time, and Belcher, who hadn't been in the house for more than 10 minutes, jumped up out of his seat and went across to her. "Allow me, madam," he says, smiling his queer little smile. "Please, allow me," and takes the hatchet from her hand. She was struck too paralytic to speak, and ever after, Belcher would be at her heels carrying a bucket or basket or load of turf, as the case might be. As Noble wittily remarked, he got into looking before she leapt, and hot water or any little thing she wanted, Belcher would have it ready before her. For such a huge man, and though I am 5'10" myself, I had to look up to him. He had an uncommon shortness, or should I say lack of speech. It took us some time to get used to him walking in and out like a ghost without a syllable out of him, especially because Hawkins talked enough for a platoon. It was strange to hear big Belcher with his toes in the ashes come out of with a solitary, "Excuse me, chum." That's right, chum. His one and only abiding passion was cards, and I will say for him, he was a good card player. He could have fleeced me and Noble many a time, only if we lost to him, Hawkins lost to us, and Hawkins played with the money Belcher gave him. Hawkins lost to us because he talked too much, and I think now we lost to Belcher for the same reason. Hawkins and Noble would spit at one another about religion into the early hours of the morning. The little Englishman, as you could see, worrying the soul out of young Noble, whose brother was a priest, with a string of questions that would puzzle a cardinal. And to make it worse, even in treating of these holy subjects, Hawkins had a deplorable tongue. I never in all my career struck across a man who could mix such a variety of cursing and bad language into the simplest topic. A terrible man was little Hawkins, and a fright to argue. He never did a stroke of work, and when he had no one else to talk to, he fixed his claws into the old woman. I'm glad to say that in her he met his match. For one day, when he tried to get her to complain profanely of the drought, she gave him a great come-down by blaming the drought upon Jupiter Pluvius, a deity neither Hawkins nor I had even heard of, though Noble said among the pagans he was held to have something to do with rain. And another day, the same Hawkins was swearing at the capitalists for starting the German war when the old dame laid down her iron, puckered up her little crab's mouth and said, "Mr. Hawkins, you can say what you please about the war, thinking to deceive me because I'm an ignorant old woman, but I know well what started the war. It was that Italian count that stole the heathen divinity out of the temple in Japan. For believe me, Mr. Hawkins, nothing but sorrow and want follows them that disturbs the hidden powers." A queer old dame, as you remark. So one evening we had our tea together and Hawkins lit the lamp and we all sat into the cards. Jeremiah Donovan came in too and sat down and watched us for a while. Though he was shy, he didn't speak much. It was easy to see he had no great love for the two Englishmen, and I was surprised it hadn't struck me so clearly before. Well, like in the story, a terrible dispute blew up late in the evening between Hawkins and Noble about capitalists and priests and love for your own country. The capitalist, says Hawkins with an angry gulp, the capitalist pays the priest to tell you about the next world so you won't notice what they do to you in this. Nonsense, man, says Noble, losing his temper. Before ever a capitalist was thought of, people believed in the next world. Hawkins stood up as if he was preaching a sermon. Oh, they did they? He said with a sneer. They believed all the things you believe? That's what you mean? And you believe that God created Adam, and Adam created Shem, and Shem created Jehoshaphat? You believe all the silly old fairy tale about Eve and Eden and the apple? Well, listen to me, chum. If you're entitled to hold to a silly belief like that, I'm entitled to hold to my own silly belief, which is that the first thing your God created was a bleeding capitalist with morality and Rolls Royce complete. All right, chum? He then says to Belcher. You're right, chum, says Belcher with his queer smile and gets up from the table to stretch his long legs into the fire and stroke his moustache. So, seeing that Jeremiah Donovan was going, and there was no knowing when the conversation about religion would be over, I took my hat and went out with him. We strolled down towards the village together, and then he suddenly stopped, and blushing and mumbling and shifting, as was his way from toe to heel, he said, I ought to be behind, keeping guard on the prisoners. And I, having it put to me so suddenly, asked him what the hell he wanted a guard on the prisoners at all for, and said that so far as Noble and me were concerned, we had talked it over and would rather be out with the column. What use is that peer to us, I asked him. He looked at me for a spell and said, I thought you knew we were keeping them as hostages. Hostages, says I, not quite understanding. The enemy, he says, in his heavy way, have prisoners belong to us. And now they talk of shooting them. If they shoot our prisoners, we'll shoot theirs and serve them right. Shoot them? Said I. The possibility just beginning to dawn on me. Shoot them exactly, said he. Now, said I, wasn't it very unforeseen of you not to tell me and Noble that? How so, he asks, seeing that we were acting as guards upon them, of course. And hadn't you reason to guess that much? We had not, Jeremiah Donovan, we had not. How were we to know when the men were on our hands so long? And what difference does it make? The enemy have our prisoners as long or longer, haven't they? It makes a great difference, said I. How so? He said sharply, but I couldn't tell him the difference it made, for I was struck too silly to speak. And when may we expect to be released from this anywhere, said I. You may expect it tonight, said he, or tomorrow, or the next day at latest. So, if it's hanging around here that worries you, you'll be free soon enough. I cannot explain it even now, how sad I felt. But I went back to the cottage, a miserable man. When I arrived, the discussion was still on, Hawkins holding forth to all and sundry that there was no next world, and Noble answering in his best canonical style that there was, but I saw Hawkins was after having the best of it. Do you know what, chum? He was saying with his saucy smile, I think you're just as big a bleeding unbeliever as I am. You say you believe in the next world, and you know just as much about the next world as I do, which is sweet damn all. What's heaven? You don't know. Where's heaven? You don't know. Who's in heaven? You don't know. You know sweet damn all. I ask you again, do they wear wings? Very well, said Noble. They do. Is that enough for you? They do wear wings. Where do they get them from? Who makes them? Have they a factory for wings? Have they a sort of store where you hand in your chit and take your bleeding wings? Answer me that. You're an impossible man to argue with, says Noble. Now listen to me. And off the pair of them went again. It was long after midnight when we locked up the Englishmen and went to bed ourselves. As I blew out the candle, I told Noble what Jeremiah Donovan had told me. Noble took it very quietly. After we'd been in bed about an hour, he asked me, did I think we ought to tell the Englishmen? I, having thought of the same thing myself, among many others, said no, because it was more than likely the English wouldn't shoot our men. And anyhow, it wasn't to be. Suppose it the brigade, who were always up and down with the 2nd Battalion and knew the Englishmen well, would be likely to want them bumped off? I think so, says Noble. It would be sort of cruelty to put the wind up them now. It was very unforeseen of Jeremiah Donovan anyhow, says I, and by Noble's silence I realised he took my meaning. So I lay there half the night and thought, and picturing myself and young Noble trying to prevent the brigade from shooting Hawkins and Belcher, sent a cold sweat out through me. Because there were men on the brigade you daren't let nor hinder without a gun in your hand. At any rate, in those days, disunion between brothers seemed to be an awful crime. I knew better after. It was next morning we found it so hard to face Belcher and Hawkins with a smile. We went about the house all day, scarcely saying a word. Belcher didn't mind as much. He was stressed into the ashes as usual, with his usual look of waiting and quietness for something unforeseen to happen. But little Hawkins gave us a bad time with his audacious jibing and questioning. He was disgusted at Noble's not answering him back. Why can't you take your beating like a man, chum? He says. You with your Adam and Eve. I'm a communist. Or an anarchist. An anarchist, that's what I am. And for hours after he went around the house mumbling with a fit tuckum, Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve. I don't know clearly how we got over that day, but get over it we did. And a great relief it was when the tea things were cleared away and Belcher said in his peaceable manner, well, chums, what about it? So we all sat around the table and Hawkins produced the cards, and at that moment I heard Jeremiah Donovan's footsteps up the path. The dark presentiment crossed my mind. I rose quietly from the table and laid my hand on him before he reached the door. What do you want? I asked him. I want the 2 soldier friends of yours, he says, reddening. Is that the way it is, Jeremiah Donovan? I ask. That's the way. There were 4 of our lads went west this morning, one of them a boy of 16. That's bad, Jeremiah, says I. At that moment Noble came out, and we walked down the path together, talking in whispers. Feeney, the local intelligence officer, was standing by the gate. What are you going to do about it? I asked Jeremiah Donovan. I want you and Noble to bring them out. You can tell them they're being shifted again. That'll be the quietest way. Leave me out of that, says Noble suddenly. Jeremiah Donovan looked at him for a minute or two. All right, so, he said peaceably. You and Feeney collect a few tools from the shed and dig a hole by the far end of the bog. Bonaparte and I will be after you in about 20 minutes. But whatever else you do, don't let anyone see you with the tools. No one must know but the four of ourselves. We saw Feeney and Noble go around to the shed where the tools were kept and sidled in. Everything, if I can so express myself, was tottering before my eyes. And I left Jeremiah Donovan to do the explaining as best he could while I took a seat and said nothing. He told them that they were to go back to the second. Hawkins let a mouthful of curses out of him and it was plain that Belcher, though he said nothing, was duly perturbed. The old woman was for having them stay in spite of us, and she did not shut her mouth until Jeremiah Donovan lost his temper and said some nasty things to her. Within the house by this time it was pitch dark, but no one thought of lighting the lamp. And in the darkness the two Englishmen fetched their khaki topcoats and said goodbye to the woman of the house. Just as a man makes a home of a bleeding place, mumbles Hawkins, shaking her by the hand. Some bastard at headquarters thinks you're too cushy and shunts you off. Belcher took her hand, very hearty. 1,000 thanks, madam, he says. 1,000 thanks for everything. As though he'd made it all up. We go around to the back of the house and down towards the fatal bog. Then Jeremiah Donovan comes out with what is in his mind. There are 4 of our lads shot by your fellows this morning, so now you're to be bumped off. Cut that stuff out, says Hawkins, flaring up. It's bad enough to be mucked about such as we are without you playing at soldiers. It's true, says Jeremiah Donovan. I'm sorry, Hawkins, but it's true. And comes out with his usual rigmarole about doing our duty and obeying our superiors. Cut it out, says Hawkins irritably. Cut it out! Then when Donovan sees he's not being believed, he turns to me. Ask Bonaparte here, he says. I don't need to ask Bonaparte. Me and Bonaparte are chums. Isn't it true, Bonaparte? Says Jeremiah Donovan solemnly to me. It is, I say. Sadly, it is. Hawkins stops. Now, for Christ's sake, I mean it. Chum, I say. You don't sound as if you mean it. You know well you don't mean it. Well, if he don't, I do, says Jeremiah Donovan. Why the hell would you want to shoot me, Jeremiah Donovan? Why the hell would you take 4 of our prisoners and shoot them in cold blood upon a barrack square? I perceive Jeremiah Donovan is trying to encourage himself with hot words. Anyway, he took little Hawkins by the arm and dragged them on. But it was impossible to make him understand that we were in earnest. From which you will perceive how difficult it was for me, as I kept feeling my Smith & Wesson and thinking, what would I do if they happened to put up a fight and ran for it? And wishing in my heart they would. I knew if only they ran, I would never fire on them. Was Noble in this? Hawkins wanted to know, and we said yes. He laughed. Why should Noble want to shoot him? Why should he want to shoot him? What had he done to us? Weren't we chums? The words lingers painfully in my memory. Weren't we? Didn't we understand him and didn't he understand us? Did either of us imagine for an instant that he'd shoot us for all the so-and-so brigadiers in the so-and-so British Army? By the time I began to perceive in the dusk the desolate edges of the bog that was to be their last earthly bed. And so a great sadness overtook my mind. I could not answer him. We walked along the edge of it in the darkness, and every now and then Hawkins would call a halt and begin again, just as if it was wound up about us being chums. And I was in despair that nothing but the cold and open grave made ready for his presence would convince him that we meant it all. But all the same, if you can understand, I did not want him to be bumped off. At last we saw the unsteady glint of a lantern in the distance and made towards it. Noble was carrying it, and Feeney stood somewhere in the darkness behind, and somehow the picture of the two of them so silent in the boglands was like the pain of death in my heart. Belcher, on recognizing Noble, said, "Hello, chum," in his usual peaceable way, but Hawkins flew at the poor boy immediately, and the dispute began all over again, only that Noble hadn't a word to say for himself and stood there with the swaying lantern between his gaitered legs. It was Jeremiah Donovan who did the answering. Hawkins asked for the 20th time, for it seemed to haunt his mind, if anybody thought he'd shoot Noble. "You would," says Jeremiah Donovan shortly. "I wouldn't, damn you." "You would if you knew you'd be shot for not doing it." "I wouldn't. Not if I was to be shot 20 times over. He's my chum. And Belcher wouldn't. Isn't that right, Belcher?" "That's right, chum," said Belcher peaceably. "Damned if I would. Anyway, who says Noble would be shot if I wasn't bumped off? What do you think I'd do if I was in Noble's place and we were out in the middle of a blasted bog? What would you do?" "I'd go with him, wherever he was going. I'd share my last bob with him and stick by him through thick and thin." "We've had enough of this," says Jeremiah Donovan, cocking his revolver. "Is there any messages you want to send before I fire?" "No, there isn't, but do you want to say your prayers?" Hawkins came out with a cold-blooded remark that shocked even me and turned to Noble again. "Listen to me, Noble," he said. "You and me are chums. You won't come over to my side, so I'll come over to your side. Is that fair? You should give me a rifle and I'll go with you wherever you want." Nobody answered him. "Do you understand me?" he said. "I'm through with it all. I'm a deserter, or anything else you like, but from this on, I'm one of you. Does that prove to you that I mean what I say?" Noble raised his head, but as Donovan began to speak, he lowered again without answering for the last time. "Have you any messages to send?" says Donovan in a cold and excited voice. "Shut up, you Donovan! You don't understand me, but these fellas do. They're my chums. They stand by me, and I will stand by them. We're not the capitalist tools you seem to think us." I alone of the crowd saw Donovan raise his Webley to the back of Hawkins' neck. And as he did so, I shut my eyes and tried to say a prayer. Hawkins had begun to say something else when Donovan let fly. And as I opened my eyes at the bang, I saw him stagger at the knees and lie out flat at Noble's feet, slowly and as quiet as a child, with the lantern light falling sadly upon his lean legs and bright farmer's boots. We all stood very still for a while, watching him settle out in the last agony. Then Belcher quietly takes out a handkerchief and begins to tie it around his eyes, for in our excitement we had forgotten to offer the same to Hawkins, and seeing it is not big enough, turns and asks for a loan of mine. I give it to him, and he knots the two together. He points with his foot at Hawkins. "He's not quite dead," he said. "Better give him another." Sure enough, Hawkins' left knee, as we see it under the lantern, is rising again. I bend down and put my gun to his ear. Then, recollecting myself and the company of Belcher, I stand up again with a few hasty words. Belcher understands what is in my mind. "Give him his first," he says. "I don't mind. Poor bastards. We don't know what's happening in him now." As by this time I am beyond all feeling, I kneel down and skillfully give Hawkins the last shot, so as to put him forever out of pain. Belcher, who is fumbling a bit awkwardly with the handkerchiefs, comes out with a laugh when he hears the shot. It's the first time I've heard him laugh, and it sends a shiver down my spine. Coming as it does so inappropriately upon the tragic death of his old friend. "Poor blighter," he says quietly, "and last night he was so curious about it all. It's very queer, chums? I always think. Now he knows about as much as he'll ever know. And last night, he was all in the dark. Donovan helps him tie the handkerchief about his eyes. Thanks, chum, he says. Donovan asks him if there are any messages he would like to send. No, chum, he says, none for me. If any of you'd like to write to Hawkins' mother, you'll find a letter from her in his pocket. But my missus left me 8 years ago. Went away with another fellow and took the kid with her. I like the feeling of a home, as you may have noticed, but I couldn't start again after that. We stand around like fools now that he can no longer see us. Donovan looks at Noble and Noble shakes his head. Then Donovan raises his Webley again, and just at that moment, Belcher laughs, his queer, nervous laugh again. He must think we're talking of him. Anyway, Donovan lowers his gun. Excuse me, chums, says Belcher. I feel I'm talking a hell of a lot, and so silly, about me being so handy about a house, but this thing come on me so sudden. You'll forgive me, I'm sure. You don't want to say a prayer? Asked Jeremiah Donovan. No, chums, he replies. I don't think that'd help. I'm ready if you want to get it over. You understand, says Jeremiah Donovan. It's not so much our doing, it's our duty, so to speak. Belcher's head is raised like a real blind man's, so that you can only see his nose and chin in the lamplight. I never could make out what duty was myself, he said. But I think you're all good lads, if that's what you mean. I'm not complaining. Noble, with a look of desperation, signals to Donovan, and in a flash, Donovan raises his gun and fires. The big man goes over like a sack of meal, and this time, there's no need of a second shot. I don't remember much about the burying, but that it was worse than all the rest, because we had to carry the warm corpses a few yards before we sunk them into the windy bog. It was all mad lonely, with only a bit of lantern between ourselves and the pitch blackness, and birds hooting and screeching all around, disturbed by the guns. Noble had to search Hawkins first to get the letter from his mother. Then, having smoothed all signs of the grave away, Noble and I collected our tools, said goodbye to the others, and went back along the desolate edge of the treacherous bog without a word. We put the tools in the shed and went into the house. The kitchen was pitch black and cold, just as we left it, and the old woman was sitting over the hearth, telling her beads. We walked past her into the room, and Noble struck a match to light the lamp. Just then she rose quietly and came to the doorway, being not at all so bold or crabbed as usual. What did you do with them? She says in a sort of whisper, and Noble took such a mortal start, the match quenched in his trembling hand. What's that? He asked without turning around. I heard you, she said. What did you hear? Asked Noble, but surely he wouldn't deceive a child the way he said it. I heard you. Do you think I wasn't listening to you putting the things back in the shed? Noble struck another match, and this time the lamp lit for him. Was that what you did to them? She said. And Noble said nothing. After all, what could he say? So then, by God, she fell on her 2 knees by the door and began telling her beads, and after a minute or two, Noble went on his knees by the fireplace. So I pushed my way out past her and stood at the door watching the stars and listening to the damn shrieking of the birds. It's so strange what you feel at such moments, and not to be written afterwards. Noble says he felt he seen everything 10 times as big, perceiving nothing around him but the little patch of black bog with the 2 Englishmen stiffening into it. But with me it was the other way. as though the patch of bog where the two Englishmen were was 1,000 miles away from me, and even Noble mumbling just behind me, and the old woman, and the birds, and the bloody stars were all far away, and I was somehow very small and very lonely, and anything that ever happened to me after, I never felt the same about